So do we all know what an oxymoron is? All right, well, I'm going to tell you. Believe it or not, oxymoron is a Greek word. It's a compound Greek word. It is arrived from the Greek word for sharp, oxy, and moros, from which we get moron, which means dull. So oxymoron, sharp, dull. Well, an oxymoron is a rhetorical device in which two seemingly contradictory words are used together for effect. So let me give you some examples. Good grief. Jumbo shrimp. Alone together. Same difference. Confirmed rumor. Known secret. Interesting sermon. Hunter, did you put that on my list? Definite, maybe. Original copy. Almost exactly. Constant variable. Only choice. All right, I think we got the idea, right? Okay. Well, an oxymoron in the Jewish culture in which Jesus lived would have been Good Samaritan. This morning, I want to continue our series of sermons from the Gospel of Luke titled Stories Jesus Told. And we're looking at several parables, several stories that Jesus told. We introduced this series last week, and I had a few things to say just on an introductory level as to what a parable is. Parables, we saw last week, come in a variety of shapes and sizes. A riddle could be designated as a parable. Analogies, proverbs, allegories, metaphors, similitudes, or stories, whether they be shorter or even longer. The purpose of the parable was to engage the listener, create reflection, promote action or some kind of a response. So I define a parable this way. A parable is an analogy used to captivate, illustrate, and motivate, and finally, to participate. So when we think about parables and when we think about stories, and if we keep these definitions in mind, we can see why Jesus might use stories, parables, to create attention, to draw his listener in and grasp some point. John Thomas of Presentation Advisors puts it this way. There are two ways you can share knowledge. You can push information out, or you can pull them in with a story. And that's what Jesus did. And so this morning, we want to look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. Probably, if you go up to anyone at Walmart and ask them if they've heard of any of the parables of Jesus, most likely everyone has heard of the Good Samaritan. Because there are organizations in our culture and society which regularly use this, at least in first century Jewish culture, oxymoron, a Good Samaritan. So we find this parable in Luke's Gospel in chapter 10, verses 25 and following. And this story, this parable of the Good Samaritan, was triggered by a question that Jesus received. So I'm going to read verses 25 through 29 here in just a moment. But let me kind of set the context for the parable. An expert in the law, we are told, asked Jesus a question. This expert in the law would have been an authority in Jewish culture in interpreting the law of Moses. Now, here's what's interesting about experts in the law in Luke's gospel. There usually is no affection for this group. They tend to be characterized as antagonists of Jesus. And we see that here in this parable. The lawyer's rationale for dialoguing with Jesus was not to learn from Jesus, Luke tells us, but to test Jesus. We also see in this encounter that this expert in the law addresses Jesus as teacher. In Luke's gospel, those who had a high respect for Jesus addressed him as Lord. We also see, when we come to the parable, that this lawyer seeks to justify himself. He seeks to make himself look right. Not only in his eyes, probably in God's eyes as well, but more importantly, in the eyes of those around him. And as we'll see when we reach the conclusion of a study of this parable, the lawyer also asked the wrong question. Right? So let's look at this dialogue, this initial encounter. Luke says that on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" Jesus replied. "How do you read it?" The lawyer answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Now, Jesus initially commends this lawyer. He quotes Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, and Leviticus 19 and verse 18. These two scriptures from the law of Moses would have been two scriptures that every Jew could have quoted. In fact, these two scriptures were foundational in the lives of every Jewish person. And so what we see as we continue to look at this encounter, that any disagreement between Jesus and this lawyer, and really any of Jesus' contemporaries, was not over the significance of these two love commands, but over their application and extent. And so what question does the lawyer ask Jesus to satisfy himself or to justify himself? Who is my neighbor? The word neighbor literally means a near dweller, thus a person who lives near another. But it also can have a broader meaning, referring to one's fellow human being. And so what this lawyer is asking is, how far does love for neighbor, a fellow human being, or maybe one who is near, how far does love reach? To ask, who is my neighbor, is a polite way of asking, who is not my neighbor? So, this encounter with this lawyer triggers this parable or this story from Jesus. And we find the parable itself in verses 30 through 35. Now, as I count, there are 6 characters in this story. All right, now so let me do some explaining of these 6 characters. First of all, there is the victim. All right, literally the text is any human being. All right, most English translations read a certain man, but it's really anyone, which means everyone. Right? The second characters are the robbers, the bandits, the thieves, notorious people. We know that Jesus was crucified between 2 men just like these robbers. Right? The third character in the story is a priest, a descendant of Aaron who offered the sacrifices in the temple. The fourth player in the story is a Levite, not being of the family of Aaron, for whom alone the priesthood was reserved. A Levite served as an assistant to the priest. It was their duty to keep the sacred utensils in the temple clean, to provide the sacred loaves, to open and shut the gates of the temple, to sing the sacred hymns in the temple, and to do many other Levitical duties. Now, notice that these 2 religious leaders are going down from Jerusalem. So they've already fulfilled their temple duties. So ceremonial cleanness was not an issue. Right? They have done their week's work, and they are going home. The fifth player in this story, Jesus has mentioned a priest, he's mentioned a Levite, and most likely this lawyer, anticipating a third character, would have thought an Israelite. But remember last week when we looked at a parable and the nature of a parable, there tends to be a shocking value to it. Well, here's the shock. Here's the surprise. It's not the expected Israelite, it is a Samaritan. Jews believed Samaritans to be of doubtful descent and inadequate theology. They only accepted the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and argued that the true temple was on Mount Gerizim. Relations between the Jews and the Samaritans were particularly poor during this period because in AD 80, some Samaritans scattered bones in the temple in Jerusalem. We know that historically happened. And that created quite a ruckus between Jews and Samaritans. In fact, there is a statement in a Jewish book titled Sirach, which is dated about 175 BC. 2 nations my soul detest, and the third is not even a people. Those who live in Seir, and the Philistines, and the foolish people that live in Shechem, which is another name for Samaria. Right? And I kind of like this one. The Jews had to change their custom of using signal fires to announce the new year because Samaritans lit fires to confuse them. That's kind of funny. That's pretty good. All right? So that illustrates the relationship between Jews and Samaritans. And then the final character in this story is the innkeeper himself. All right? So, before we read the parable, a little additional insight. The ancient road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a distance of about 17 miles. The descent was 200 feet per mile, as Jerusalem is 2,500 feet above sea level, and Jericho is 800 feet below sea level. Which is, do the math, that's a drop of over 3,300 3,300 feet, okay? Anybody ever been to the Holy Land? One of the things that kind of stood out to Lori and I when we were able to make this trip in 2017. But most itineraries follow this pattern, right? You land in Tel Aviv, you get on a bus, you go north to Caesarea Maritima, then you cut across north to the Galilean area. And you usually spend quite a bit of time, 2 or 3 days there, in and around the Sea of Galilee, see all the sights. The Sea of Galilee is beautiful. It's plush. It's green. All right? Then you leave the Sea of Galilee and you begin to drive south along the Jordan River. And as you travel south, it gets brown really quickly. And the terrain is rocky and rugged, and it's hilly and treacherous. So this is the road from Jerusalem, 2,500 feet above sea level, down through this dry, arid region to Jericho. And Jericho, by the way, history tells us, was the home of a very big percentage of priests and Levites. Right? The 2 denarii given to the innkeeper that we'll read about here in just a moment would have been worth 2 days' wages and would have covered room and board for at least 2 weeks. So this Samaritan kind of went the extra mile, so to speak. Not only did he bandage the wounds of the victim, but he also provided lodging for at least 2 weeks, okay, in Jericho. Depending on if he put him up in a Ramada or a Hilton, all right, it kind of depends, all right? So let's read the parable. In reply to the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor? A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. End of story. But not the end of the dialogue. The dialogue continues in verses 36 and 37. Jesus now asks a question of the lawyer. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Notice the disjunction between the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor, and Jesus' question, which of these 3 was a neighbor? You see, Jesus moves the neighbor from the object to the subject. Or as Klein Snodgrass says in his really thick book on the parables of Jesus, one cannot define one's neighbor, one can only be a neighbor. And then the final point that's usually made, the expert in the law could not even say the word Samaritan. So, how do you participate in this story? if we said that the nature of these stories is to draw us in as the listener and to find some application to put ourselves into the story. Right? Well, you have one of 6 possibilities. All right? We've identified 6 characters, 6 players in this story. Perhaps this morning you relate more to the victim. You've been hurt. You've been robbed. You've been beaten. You've been taken advantage of. I would like to think that you're surrounded by a group of Good Samaritans who will assist you, who will help you bind those wounds and provide a place of care and comfort for you. Now, I hope there's no one here that identifies with the robbers. If you do, we need to talk later. Now, the next 2, though, the priest and the Levite. We really don't know why they chose, upon seeing this victim, to pass by on the other side. I've tried to already eliminate the excuse of a religious concern. Because again, they were not going up to Jerusalem to serve, where being ceremonially clean and pure would be important. They had already done that. They were going home for a while, down to Jericho. Regardless, it would just be an excuse. Then there is the Samaritan, who we typically classify as good. One who identifies this person in need and assist. Or maybe you identify with the innkeeper. All right? Innkeepers are important, right? The word there literally means to welcome or to receive all. And so some of us sometimes find ourselves in that particular role. Right? But again, if you consider the whole context of the story and you recall who the story was given to, that Jesus, I think, is challenging us to reflect upon our own lives in conjunction with the attitude of this expert in the law. And so I believe Jesus would say, be like the Samaritan. Be like the Samaritan. So how do we do that? Well, Jesus gives us 3 ways that we can be like the Samaritan in this story. First of all, this parable will not let us avert our eyes. Last week, in the first story we looked at, the parable of the sower, we emphasized the soils, and the point was how we hear. What does it mean to really listen to Jesus? Well, here in this story, it's how we see. It's how we see. Notice, for the priest and the Levite, seeing is the impetus for caution and self-protection. They see the victim, and they pass by on the other side. For the Samaritan, seeing is the source of compassion, which then moves him to help. So as we go about our day, and as we encounter people of all kinds, who do we see? What do we see? Do we even notice? Do we turn our attention away, like the priest and the Levite? Or does our seeing move us to become involved, however we might be involved? So number one, we cannot avert our eyes. Number two, in the words of Reggie McNeil, get off your donkey. There's another word that could be used. In fact, the King James may use that. I don't know. All right. This parable is all about doing. Go back through, read the parable, and count how many times you find the word do or some form of it. Right? So again, it's one thing to see, and it's one thing to maybe feel sorry for whoever it is, and another to actually do something about it. And the Samaritan did. All right? He got off his donkey. He bandaged the wounds. He put the victim on his own donkey, Luke says, and off they went for further care. So, being a good Samaritan certainly involves looking with the eyes of Jesus and having a heart like Jesus, but it's also doing something. It's being moved to respond and help. And then number three, this parable underscores that compassion and mercy are key factors in being a disciple of Jesus. They're synonymous with each other. But I particularly like this word that's translated compassion in most of our English versions. This word is used 12 times in the New Testament, only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in every occurrence of this word, it refers either to Jesus or to a Christ-like figure like the Good Samaritan in a parable. And the word, it literally means your guts. I mean, if I can just be blunt, that's what it means. And for a person in the culture of Jesus, the deepest rooted emotions were embedded within your guts. And we're like that, right? We say we love someone with all of our heart. By the way, public service announcement for all you men. Don't forget what Friday is. Okay, speaking of love, it's Valentine's Day. Duh. Okay? All right. There's my public service announcement. All right. We talk about having a nervous stomach. Okay? Or we say we have a gut feeling. Right? That's this word compassion. It's the strongest, most deeply felt emotion. And this emotion, it's more than that. As we've seen, it moves us to respond. It moves us to do something. It moves us to extend mercy to an individual or to a group. Right? And so compassion and mercy, key factors in being a follower of Jesus. Now, let's be really honest. Knowing how to implement this parable is difficult. Anyone agree with that? All right. Let me illustrate it. Most likely, because of our location and our context, every single one of us today, when we leave this building and pull out of this parking lot, we're going to pass somebody like that victim. And so how are we going to respond? Okay? We've eliminated religious excuses. We can't say we're going to church. We can't say we're going to life group. whatever, right? So this is tough. I've said this before. One of the most challenging ministries is a church's benevolent ministry. And on my list of things that a person should have to do in order to go to heaven, okay, remember, this is my list, is to serve as deacon of benevolence for 1 month. Ask John Helton how difficult, members of his team, how difficult some of these decisions can be. All right? So how does this parable affect our approach to the motorist stranded on the highway, the panhandler on the corner, the benevolent case in which we are suspicious of being conned? I like to tell this story. It was a hot summer day in Tulsa, and I was in my office. The doorbell rang. Our receptionist answered the doorbell. It was a man and about his 10-year-old son needing some help. So Laura invited them in. I visited with the gentleman, gave him a couple of sacks of groceries, helped him carry them out to his car. When I got back inside, Laura was laughing. I said, "What are you laughing at?" Said, "When you took the man into your office, the little boy said, 'It sure is a hot day to be working the churches.'" I mean, those are the decisions, okay, that you have to make, right? The New Testament teaches what Christian character is. It's full of compassion and mercy, not what actions must be done in each particular case. I wish Jesus maybe would have given us some more help there. Right? We understand our identity by the example that Jesus left us. And in this story, the example of the Good Samaritan. Disciples of Jesus are those who refuse boundaries for the identification of neighbor and instead even love for their enemies. With that identity in place, each disciple must determine and decide what path of wisdom best expresses that identity. But here's the key. Whatever decision we make, we must resist the temptation of seeking to justify ourselves. To whom will you be a neighbor?